Okay, we are now at 3:02. So I'm just going to get started, and if anybody additional joins us in progress, hopefully they can catch up. So thank you everyone for joining us today. And I am going to do what we do these days and share my screen. Okay, so welcome. For those of you who don't yet know me, I'm Zahava Stadler. I focus on school funding policy at the Education Trust. And what is the Education Trust? Hopefully you're familiar with our work, but we are a national nonprofit that works to close opportunity gaps, specifically focused on the experiences of students of color and students from low-income families. We are a research and advocacy organization, and we focus on a whole range of equity issues affecting the student experience from preschool through post-secondary education. So to get started, presumably all of you are here because you are interested in the idea of adding some school funding context to your education reporting. So in order to get started, I would love to hear about your past work in this area. So I'm going to launch a poll. Have you written one or more stories about school funding in the last year? So I'd love to hear from everybody. I'll give you a minute and a half or so to ponder this question. Okay, sorry, almost there. It looks like we have near full participation, so I'd love for everybody to see this. So it's interesting. We have a number of people that have specifically covered school funding, but there's also a range of people who have included school funding facts or angles in other stories, even if they have not covered a school funding story specifically, which always warms my heart to hear. And what we're going to be talking about today is quite a lot about tools that can help you do that, either in stories about school funding or in stories that are broader. Oh, I'm not sure I clicked share results. Apologies, everyone. So as you can see, we had about an even split between the first and third options. So as we move forward, just to outline what it is we're trying to cover today. First of all, we want to think about when you might want to include funding policy information in a story that you're reporting. Second, this is the tool that I really want to highlight for you. I want everyone to become familiar with and get comfortable with FundEd, which is a national database of school funding policies, and specifically to understand how you can use it to inform and contextualize your reporting on education issues. So we're going to start with the obvious. Sometimes you are literally covering school finance as a topic in and of itself. So a few obvious openings when you might do that are budget events. So in most states, education is the single biggest area of state budget spending. So state budget events are school funding events. And this is obviously true when you have a new state budget that you're passing, but it's also true when anything big affects state finances. So for instance, Connecticut passed a school funding reform in a moment of literal state bankruptcy a few years ago, because when something has to change, something big may change. Surpluses, this whole legislative session right now in Minnesota is about how to use an unprecedented surplus to support students better in schools. Infusions of federal aid are similar. So major state budget events are obvious openings for school funding stories. I don't think that'll be a surprise to anyone. Another obvious opening is direct legislative activity on the issue. So if anyone here is from Tennessee, this has been a major story for you over the last few months. The legislature here just passed a total overhaul of the state education funding system. We also have instances where the legislature has elected to tackle school funding, but has delegated the task of studying the best system or of suggesting new funding policies to an appointed commission. And recent reforms in Texas and Maryland were based on commission recommendations. So of course you would cover the outcome. What's their final report? What are legislative actions that come out of the committee's work? But there's also plenty of activity to cover along the way, hearings and testimony, and how students and families and local stakeholders are getting involved in those commission proceedings. And the third obvious opening that I want to highlight is school funding litigation. So this is another obvious opportunity to cover school funding issues. So as you can see from this map, which was put together by the Center for Educational Equity at Teachers College, nearly every state has had a school funding ruling at some point. And even in states where there hasn't been a court decision, there has often been litigation that's produced an important settlement, like in Delaware recently. So this is another clear opening for school funding reporting. And I've added markers here to the map in a handful of states that have had recent or ongoing litigation that's gotten important coverage. So those are perhaps the obvious openings. I also want to talk about the less obvious ones, because I probably don't need to convince you to include school funding policy information in a story about the state education budget. But I'm also going to make the argument for including that kind of context in education stories that are not directly about school finance. So to me, and I'm a little biased here because this is what I do, but to me, school funding policy is the first order systems issue that affects students and their experiences. So many of us probably already believe that money matters for most things in education, at least in the sense that everything educators want to do for kids, whether it's a better physical school facility or attracting and hiring great teachers or providing strong mental health supports, obviously all of those things cost money. Having enough money in the budget matters. But it's not just the amount of money that matters, it's also the how of money, how the state hands it out to districts, and whether that system does a good job of matching resources to students' needs. So let me tell you what I mean. All of these four things that you see are genuine challenges that have been reported about schools in these states over the past few years. So what we see here is in Colorado, there have been rising numbers of students from low-income backgrounds enrolled in suburban schools around Denver, excuse me. In Alabama, we have something that's a problem in many places, which is that districts in higher income communities get many more experienced teachers than those in lower income areas. Idaho, we've seen districts really struggle with rising numbers of special education students and serving them effectively. Mississippi has a real dropout problem related to English learners. None of these are problems that you would only see in these states, but what is unique to these states are these things. And these are things that weren't always included in the coverage of these challenges. These pieces of information about each of the state's funding formulas. Yes, there's rising need in the Denver suburbs, but the formula is actually designed to specifically support small and rural districts really heavily, and that ties up a lot of funding, even in the face of changing circumstances. Alabama has a fairly unusual system, though it is also the case in a couple of other states, where the most teacher funding is explicitly sent to the districts that already have the most experienced teachers. So that reinforces the problem rather than helping districts solve it. Idaho has a mechanism in its formula designed for simplicity, but maybe not accuracy, where special education is funded based on an assumed number of special education students. They just assume that every district will be 6% students with disabilities, and they fund them accordingly, which means that if you have an increase in your population, you may struggle to keep up. Mississippi, we can talk about the dropout experience that we're seeing with students learning English, but what might also be important to know is that Mississippi doesn't provide any additional funding for English learners, and in fact is one of only 2 states in the country of which that's true. So as you can see, these problems are at least partly related to the structure of the school funding system. It's not only about having enough, it's also about the how. And that's why I want to make the case that knowing how a state funds its public school system, separate from how much, that the how matters, and that it really matters for understanding the challenges that children are experiencing in schools. And that secret funding policy factor that may underlie and contribute to a classroom level problem is not always the easiest thing to uncover. And that's what I'm hoping to help you with today. So before I share the tool that we're featuring, which I'm hoping can help you learn about the funding policy in whatever state you cover and compare it to funding policy in states around the country, before we do that, I first want to give you a Formula 101 to cover some of the fundamentals that we're talking about. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes on this before I start demonstrating the tool. But if questions come up for you as we go through this, please put them in the Q&A box that you have, and I will pause after the 101 portion and try to respond to any questions that come in before we talk about the tool. Okay, so every state has a funding formula. The structure is written into state statute, and generally speaking, these formulas have three big steps. Step one, the state will use a formula to determine a target funding amount for each district for the year. It'll consider factors that vary from state to state. Might include how many students are in the district, how many students fall in particular need categories, are there particular student-teacher ratios that are specified in the state, things like that. The state will use a formula to determine that target amount for each district for the year. In this hypothetical small district, it's 17-ish million. Step two, the state will almost always have a way of determining how much money the local district should reasonably be expected to kick in from local sources. This is mainly designed around the fact that districts don't have the same access to local money. A lot of that money comes from property taxes. Properties don't cost the same everywhere. And so the state will have a local contribution expectation. And then step three, the balance of the formula amount is provided as state aid. So in this district of the 17 million, the expectation is that the district is providing about 7, and therefore the state will provide the last 10. This very broad strokes kind of formula is what you see pretty much everywhere around the country. So let's talk about the questions that you as a journalist might have based on the structure of your formula. So the formula amount. First of all, if we start with a basic funding amount per student, is it realistic? Does it bear any relationship to what districts are actually spending on the ground? Is the formula capturing those needs? What student needs are or are not considered in the formula? And how does that relate to the actual student populations that are being served in the district? If, like Idaho, you have an assumption that 6% of all students will have disabilities, does that bear any relationship to the true number of students with disabilities on the ground? Also, you know your state, and chances are there's a fair amount of diversity between districts. If the districts in your state are very different, maybe a very uneven distribution of students where some places are very sparse and some are very dense, or where there are clusters of students from low-income backgrounds that are in particular districts and not elsewhere. Does the formula consider those differences? How does the mechanism in the formula match up with what's really happening on the ground with communities' needs and experiences? And then on the local share side, so I mentioned that there's a way of calculating the expected local contribution from local funds. So remember, the point of this is that not every district has the same ability to raise local dollars for education. And if the state didn't consider those differences, let's say they just funded half the target amount automatically, some districts would struggle to make up the other half. Others would very easily be able to cover that and then some. So there's some kind of mechanism usually to rebalance that. It's usually called equalization. Usually the way this works is that the state will have some kind of expected local tax rate, like a 1% property tax, and that same rate will raise more money in some places than in others. So the amount that would be raised by that rate in that district is factored into the equation. And sometimes the local share calculation also considers other factors like local income levels or revenue from local sales taxes, because those things can also be unequally distributed around the state and affects districts' abilities to raise local dollars. So questions you might have about this: first of all, is it reasonable? I said 1%, but it might be 0.5%. It might be 3%. Is the local tax rate reasonable, or is it very burdensome in some communities? And then do we consider anything beyond property taxes? So you might have a place where income and property values don't correlate very closely. Maybe you have a town that's a vacation destination, and you have a lot of low income service workers in that town and a lot of very expensive homes. There might be a real divergence between what's happening between property taxpayers and income taxpayers. Is that taken into account? What's going on in the communities that are actually in your state? And does the local share really capture what they can really afford to contribute to schools? Does it also include sales taxes? If it doesn't, what does that mean when some districts have huge malls or big downtowns and some districts really don't? So thinking about whether this policy is doing a good job of responding to this real reality on the ground of communities in your state. So one more big policy thing I want to highlight is what I call the local revenue loophole. This is a pretty important wrinkle. So in step 2, we talked about the state calculation for what the local district is expected to raise, but expected does not mean actual, and how much to actually raise is a local decision. So here's a couple of possibilities of what can happen. One is local underfunding. Let's say the district is allowed to spend or raise less than the local contribution. So we still consider the local contribution sort of a mathematical fiction in the equation. So if the district doesn't fully fund it, that creates a funding gap. The state aid doesn't increase to fill it. This is actually not that common. Usually districts do not underfund their local contribution. One example of where you might see this, for instance, is there are some districts in Arizona that are made up almost entirely of retirement communities. So you have a lot of taxpayers that don't have kids in the schools or that are think of themselves as past that phase of their life. And there's a divergence between the interests of the taxpayers and the interests of the school-going community. That might be a case where you see local underfunding. More common is additional local funding. If the district is permitted to spend or raise more money than the local share and it chooses to do that, and this is the source actually of lots of funding inequities because wealthy districts have such an easy time raising more money relative to low wealth districts. And since all of this is over and above what the formula calls for, this isn't part of that whole equalization rebalancing thing. It's treated as icing on the cake. If a wealthy school district wants to raise their property tax from 1% to 1.1%, that extra 1/10 of a percentage point is going to raise so much more money than it might in a low wealth district. So all of those things are local decisions, but they can also be affected by state policy. The state can set guardrails around what districts may or must raise, and any minimums or maximums for actual local revenue are set in state law, just like the rest of the funding policy. But in lots of states, the law just doesn't do that. It doesn't set those guardrails, or sometimes it sets them so wide that there's lots of room for these outcomes that we're seeing. So questions you might have about this area of policy: is the local share a ceiling, or can districts raise that additional money? How big a source of inequity is that? Is the local share a requirement, a floor, or is it just an expectation? Is anybody underfunding the local share? Is there a funding gap? If so, who's underfunding it? Is it high wealth communities that don't feel the need? Is it low wealth communities who can't manage it? What's driving those communities to invest less money in schools? So that was a really quick sprint through a funding formula 101. And the next thing I'm going to do is demonstrate the tool that I was referring to, which is really the meat of this, but I want to make sure that we are, that everyone's with me for the moment. I'm not seeing anything in the Q&A, so I'm going to wait a second to see if anybody wants to drop anything in the question box or the chat specifically about funding formulas. In the meantime, there is a different question about how do we find out what budget documents school districts are required to keep in each state, which is an interesting and state-specific question. Unfortunately, that's not something that's in the database that I'm going to demonstrate, but it's the kind of yes or no question that should be fairly easy to get from folks. I'll tell you, my ace in the hole for questions like this, honestly, are the research staff at the state legislature. They are generally some of the only people in the state who really understand the funding system and are an invaluable resource for technical questions like this about what requirements districts have to comply with. But it's a great question when you're trying to do a local deep dive and you want to compare places' goals with their actual budgets. So I'm not seeing any questions coming through the Q&A box about funding, about the funding policy specifically. So I'm going to move forward and head into the meat of this, where I'm going to demonstrate our tool and give you an opportunity to spend some time with it yourself. So in a moment, I'm going to ask you to go into this website, pull up another window, and go into the website to look for some information. So pay attention now when I show you how it works. So just by way of introduction, FundEd is a national database of school funding policies in all states. It was created by EdBuild, an organization that I used to work for that focused on school funding equity specifically. It closed its doors in 2020. The team at the Education Trust has just completed a full update of the policy information in the database. So I'm going to stop share for a moment so that I can pull up the website for you and we can spend a minute in it together. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that. So this is the homepage of the FundEd database. And just on the homepage, you'll see some introductory information about the basics of funding policy. But what I really want to show you right now that I think are going to be most useful for your purposes are the national and state pages. So first, if you click national at the top of the website, it'll take you to this tab of national policy maps. As you can see, there's a US map here and buttons at the top to navigate to different kinds of policies whose information is included in the database. Right now, we're looking at the formula type map, which is a question of what's the basic structure, what's the basic type of formula that this state uses? Is it student-based, resource-based, program-based, or something, or do they lack a formula? Let's say you're not sure what that means. First of all, you can mouse over the item on the legend to highlight the states that are in that category. You can also hit the little information button to get a description of what is meant by that category. So sometimes it's a categorization like this. Sometimes it's something simpler, like, does the state differentiate funding by students' grade levels, yes or no? Not a complicated question, but an important one. So these national policy maps will provide a snapshot view of, hey, is this the prevailing practice or is it an outlier? What's the range of policy here? In special education, you'll get the sense there's a whole lot of different approaches to special education funding. These maps are a great way of tallying up quickly who does what. And as you can see in the legend, you get a little number in parentheses telling you which states use that system primarily or as part of a hybrid. Anything that's got stripes on it and looks like a necktie is a hybrid system. So this is the national map. You can also mouse over any state to get a quick tooltip with a short form of a policy summary about that, or you can click on that state to jump through to its state page. And the state pages are what I'm going to show you next. Right at the top here, you see next to national, there is a state tab. I'm going there. And as it's loading, you can see that there is a list of all the states, and most of you will have a specific coverage area that is of interest to you. So let's say you are from Arizona. You can pull up an individual state page, and all of the things that you just saw buttons for above the map will be a section on this summary page where, written out in sentences, you get a description of the state's policy. This is the short form displayed by default, but you can also click the little arrow on the right to fully expand it. Let's say you'd like to know where this information came from. You can click the citation button for more information. We've also uploaded local copies of those files so the links don't go dead. And then let's say you just want to expand all the summaries on the page or look at all the citations on the page. That functionality is here too. The last thing I'll highlight for you about the state page is this little plus sign to the right of the state name. Over here, you can add a state to compare. So let's say you're in Arizona, you might be interested to pull up for comparison the policy in New Mexico. and that can provide side-by-side comparisons for up to 5 states. Okay, so I've just shown you the basics of the national page and the state page. And what I'd love to do now is ask all of you to go there and spend some time answering a question. So I'm going to chat the homepage link for FundEd right here. So if you go to this link, this is the homepage for FundEd. And what I'm going to ask you all to do is to click national at the top of the policy maps, at the top of the screen, excuse me, to get to the policy maps. And just pulling up the slides one more time. Hopefully everyone has been able to navigate to the website and click national at the top. If anybody hasn't managed to do that, please chat me. And as you can see, what I'd like you all to do is just do a little bit of an exercise to find a piece of information. So if you click the button at the top of the national map labeled poverty, this will bring up a map of whether or not states provide funding for students in poverty. And you can see that the 2 shades of blue are differentiated for whether that money is provided on a per student basis. That is, every student from a low income background is generating the same amount, or whether it's based on concentrations of poverty. And so if everybody could take a look and answer a few questions for yourself in the next 2 minutes. First of all, how many states provide funding for students in poverty generally of any kind? You can see that number in the legend on the left, or scan the states in the map. So how many states provide funding for students specifically in poverty, that allocation that's the same for every student, versus how many consider district concentrations of poverty, some kind of variation? And what I'd like you to do is look at what category your coverage state falls into, and chat the answer specifically to question 3 with the name of the state that you're looking at. So if you're from Arizona, you'd be answering the question, does Arizona provide funding for students in poverty, or based on district concentrations of poverty, or both? Right, and we're seeing that Delaware concentrated poverty, right? Delaware has a grant program that's specifically based on concentrated poverty. We're seeing that Texas also has a concentrated poverty allocation. I think, if I'm not mistaken, I'm not looking at it this second because I'm looking at this, but I think Texas may be striped, that it has money per student that also varies for concentration. New York also concentration, Virginia a mix of both, Florida neither. Good information that may be of interest, and I believe there's actually some legislative advocacy afoot to try and change that in Florida. Right, so Rhode Island has that per student poverty. So now that you've had the experience of looking at the national policy maps and pulling out a state of interest from the national context, I'd love to send you over to an individual state page. Previously, I shared the homepage link. So you can click state at the top of your screen where you already are. You can also navigate directly to the state landing page at the link that I just put in the chat, and choose your state from the menu. If you cover multiple states, you can pick your favorite and we won't tell. And so as you can see, I'm asking you to scroll down to the section called English Language Learner and click those arrows on the right. Don't forget to fully expand the summary. Make sure you're looking at all that information. So the question is, does your state provide English learner funding, and how much is it? Or how large a percentage boost is it per English learner? Can you tell? Is the policy transparent about that? And I'd love to hear the answer to question 2 in the chat when you're able. And if you can't tell the answer, say that too. The last question I just want you to consider is, does it appear to be flexible funding? Meaning, is the money tagged to the student with a dollar amount per student or a multiplier applied to a base amount for every student? So that's in a weighted student funding formula. Does it start with a base per pupil amount and then get boosted through a multiplier for students in particular need categories? Those would be pretty flexible because that money is tagged to the student. Or is it a grant tied to a specific program or use? So when you've determined how big a funding boost it is, or if you've determined that that isn't clear, share that with us in the chat. Right? We're seeing a couple of examples that are coming through about Virginia and Delaware so far. Right? Rhode Island has a percentage boost, so that 1.1 multiplier means a 10% boost to the base amount that goes out for students without identified needs. Delaware has a grant program, so that's 500 per student, but it's part of a grant program. So there are limited uses. Districts have to specify what they're doing with it. New York indeed has complicated math. Very, very perceptive, and something you could say about every element of the New York school funding formula. I would say New York's funding calculation is highly targeted and highly non-transparent. I'll give everyone one last minute before we move to one last question that I have for you. Okay, so one more thing for you to figure out on the state page. So I'm going to ask you to pull up a second state for comparison. Remember, there's that little plus sign at the top right next to the name of the state you're already looking at. So pull up another state that's of interest to you. If you're in New York, you might be interested in New Jersey, or maybe if you are in a state where you want to see something completely different. If you're in Texas, you might pull up California. Whatever kind of comparison point you think is of interest, and make sure to fully expand the summary again for English learner funding so you're seeing the whole thing for comparison purposes. So does that second state provide English learner funding? Does it provide more or less than the first state you were looking at? Can you tell? And is the funding more or less flexible than the one that you just looked at? So I'm going to give everybody a couple minutes to try and figure that out based on the funded state pages they're looking at. Okay, we're hearing that Maryland seems to provide more English learner funding than Virginia and more flexible money. I would agree with that assessment. That's, I think, a pretty apt reading of the information in FundEd. Right, we have a New York versus New Jersey, and it is much more transparent than New York just because it's a much simpler structure, but hard to compare the two really because of the complexity of New York. Also because in a weighted student funding formula, you have to do a little bit of math. If it says it's 1.5 times a base, you probably need to look at the dollar amount in the base amount section on the state page to see what 1.5 times that number would actually equal. So there's a little bit of arithmetic to be done. Okay, so yes, Massachusetts is confusing in its own way. The EL funding is different for different grade levels. There's an assumption there baked into the policy that would be an interesting assumption to interrogate, that English language services are cost different amounts at different grade levels. In general, the Massachusetts system is full of that kind of little matrix of grade versus service. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I want to just demonstrate one more element of the FundEd database for you. So again, I am going to do what we do and switch the screen share. So apologies for any slowness here, but I am going to go back to the screen that we were just on together. Everybody's probably already looking at something that looks like this, right? Those state pages with the side-by-side comparisons. So I want to highlight for you that there's another tab up here called Reports. And this, I think some of these features will be very useful to you as journalists. So here we have a number of options where you can select a state report and get all the information that you were just looking at on a state page, but in an easy to share PDF. Then there are also state comparison reports here where you can pull up two states side by side if somebody's always asking you about a comparison state, for instance, that might be useful. But what I really want to highlight for you as journalists is something that really might be useful is this issue report. Here, you can pull a full report for any one of the issues covered in the database. So it might be what type of formula do they use? It might be how do they fund for English learners? It may be how do they address concentrated poverty? All of those issues, you can have an automatically generated report that will give you the policy summary on that issue for all 50 states and DC. So that is a great reference if you're covering, for instance, the experience of a particular student population in your state to be able to add a snapshot, look at all of the state's policies for supporting that student group. I'll also just highlight there's a custom reports function here where you can build your own spreadsheet report with any combination of states and districts. Also, I'm not going to go through this right now because it would take a little while, but you'll notice some of you, it may have caught your attention that there's a button at the top that's called Charters. So there is a companion site to FundEd that's similarly structured that talks about how states fund their charter schools. So if that's of interest, feel free to click through and you can take a look at those policies as well. Okay. So for the final part of the presentation, before we open for questions, I am going to share my screen one last time just to talk about some concrete examples of coverage and how FundEd can be helpful to you as you're doing that kind of piece. So let's say you are covering a school funding issue explicitly. This is a clip from a 2017 article that was written during a legislative process seeking to replace the school funding system in Kansas because the Kansas State Supreme Court had found it to be unconstitutional. So this article does something that I think is really, really common in school funding coverage, and that is that first and foremost, it gives the top line budget numbers. How much would this change increase school funding in total across the state? Very, very common approach. And that also makes particular sense in this context because this reporter is writing in a moment when the Supreme Court ruling just found that the state funding system was inadequate, it was underfunded. So those big numbers are top of mind for everyone in the conversation. You'll also see that the article includes a quick reference to the idea that there might be a change in formula structure, that revamped formula language, not just the formula amounts. It also says it would target more money towards what the state calls at-risk students, but we don't get any further sense of what's happening to the structure of the formula policy. And I totally understand why this article and the vast majority of the coverage of this legislative process focused on the big dollar amounts. But I also know something else, that dollar amounts change in every budget. The structure of the school funding system, though, does not see big changes very often. So those structural policy choices are what really matter for the long term. And as it happens, there were big structural changes as part of this law. The state went from handing out all of its funding through block grants and moved to a very different student-based calculation. So one value add of the FundEd database here might have been to tally how many states use block grants to hand out their core school funding amounts to districts. At the time, it would have told you the answer was 1, Kansas, and that's it. There were none other, versus how many states use a student-based allocation. At the time, about half the states in the country. FundEd could also help you add detail comparing the proposed formula add-ons for instance, students from low-income backgrounds or English learners that were part of the formula proposal, compare those to similar allocations in other states. That kind of policy information could help the reader think about the story, not just in terms of the current budget, but also in terms of the policy elements that are likely to last for many years into the future. Okay, so by way of comparison, let's contrast this to these bits of a more recent article about the brand new Tennessee school funding policy change, which I mentioned earlier is really hot off the presses. So this proposal was explicitly messaged by the governor as a big change to the type of formula that the state has, rather than just a change to the amount of school funding in the budget. So it makes sense that this report would highlight the structural change and offer some details more so than maybe the Kansas one. Note that the article does open with some top line budget numbers, but the report is also conscious of the structure that those dollars would flow through. It splits apart the proposed total of per pupil funding versus the proposed total of extra support for students needing the most help. So that already is a bit of structural awareness, even in those top line budget numbers. The article also references the number of states nationally with the kind of formula that Tennessee is proposing to adopt. That's key national context that you can get from FundEd, and some additional valuable information that you might pull in using FundEd could include comparisons for these things in the bullets at the bottom. So these is part of a bulleted list in the article. And it says, for instance, this proposal has 25% more for economically disadvantaged students. What FundEd could help you determine is, how does that percentage boost stack up nationally or against other states in the region? And we're talking about a 25% boost over and above a base amount of $6,860, as the article tells us. So 25% of that is $1,715. That's the bump we're talking about for students from low-income backgrounds. How does that number compare to the dollars that other states provide for students in this category? Is Tennessee proposing to become a national leader here, or to match the median state? Will it still lag behind best practices? So incorporating the FundEd policy information could help take this to the next level. So that's the value add when you're reporting on school funding stories. But what about what I referred to earlier as those less obvious stories? So let's talk about academic coverage. So one of the great things about FundEd is that so much of the information is organized by student category, so that when you're talking about student groups and their experiences in academics, there's a lot of funding policy context that you can bring in related to how the funding policy treats those groups. So this is an article about a Montana state plan to improve student academic performance scores. There is no mention of funding in this article whatsoever. What it does do is that it covers the goals and requirements that the plan has for several student fund subgroups. So I would suggest, again, I'm biased school funding person, but I would think that there would be a significant value add if the reporting were able to easily pull in information about the resources provided in the state to support those different student subgroups. So for instance, there's a big feature here about the performance of students with disabilities. It might be useful to note that Montana does not give districts funding for individual students with disabilities or differentiate funding at all based on students' needs or specific disabilities. Instead, special ed funding in Montana is handed out at a flat rate for every student in the district, regardless of the actual number of students with disabilities, regardless of the seriousness of their resource needs. It's a flat assumption system. That might be interesting to note as we're talking about students with disabilities lagging behind proficiency. The article also mentions goals for English learner proficiency, and one really important context might be that Montana is one of only 2 states in the country that does not provide specific funding for English learners at all, along with Mississippi. So those factors could definitely contribute to the state meeting or not meeting the proficiency goals in this plan. And I think it would probably enrich the article to provide that context, but it's not the easiest thing to find. FundEd is a great shortcut for a reporter to find that information without having to do a lot of digging. Here's a very different example. I've pulled a few selections from this brand new article on the Pascagoula-Gautier School District in Mississippi. So this district is seeing greater success with English learners than most other districts in the state. And this is a great article. It's full of very rich detail about individual students and teachers, and it's looking at what's actually happening on the ground in this district to support English learners towards success. And I've given you the bits of the article that are more about the state national context because that's more useful for our purposes. So kudos to this reporter for calling out that there is no state funding for English learners in Mississippi. And this reporter presumably did her own state-by-state legwork to determine, as you can see in the last paragraph I've pulled here, that nearby states Arkansas, North Carolina, and Alabama do provide English learner funding. That process probably would have been a lot easier and faster for her using FundEd, but she would also have been able to pull the starker fact that, as I just said, not only does Mississippi lag behind its neighbors on this score, but actually that Mississippi doesn't have any funding for English learners and that it's a real outlier, that it's one of only 2 states to not have specific English learner funding. So this piece goes right away for the key context that I love to see. And I just know that the FundEd database would have made this reporter's job easier and also allowed them to have just a slightly more national perspective. Okay, so that's all I have for you in terms of content, but I also have an invitation. I understand that this was really quick and that some of you may be interested in talking more specifically about school funding issues in your state, or you might be interested in talking more specifically about how to use FundEd in your coverage or just user issues. So if you would like to book a time with me to have a conversation about any of that, I'm putting the URL in the chat as well as on the slide. And so you can feel free to book time with me if that's of interest to you. The other thing I want to share is that there is a FundEd user guide. So this link to the FundEd quick guide for users might be helpful to you as you're navigating around. You're like, wait, I saw that thing about the state page and comparisons. How do I do that again? So this is, I think, 3 pages. It's not like a big heavy manual, but to help you make your way through the database in a useful way. So I hope that I'll be having some follow-up conversations with some of you in office hours. But in the meantime, I'm happy to pause and take questions. So I think I'm going to check the chat to see what we have. And there was an early question here from Allie saying, do I feel like inequity tends to come from funding formulas or from something else? School funding is always mysterious because everyone is supposed to have the same amount of money, but that doesn't translate to realities on the ground. And I think that the key thing to remember here actually is what I showed earlier about the local funding loophole, that there is a common formula that sets a target for every district. Within that formula, there's a state-local split of responsibility that hopefully is appropriate to what that district can raise if it's a good policy. But there is also leeway almost always for districts to raise extra money outside the formula or additional money over and above what the state targets for that district. And that is where a lot of the inequities come into the system. So knowing what those guardrails are around local dollars is really, really important. So also state legislative research staff, I shouted out earlier as a great resource. So how do we find them? Nearly every state will just have a nonpartisan research office of some kind that literally going to the state legislative website. It's called something a little different in every state, but very little clicking around on the state legislative website. You should be able to find the legislative research office. So it is not specific to individual legislators' offices. It is a nonpartisan service to all legislators that exists in the chamber. So that's something that you should generally be able to find on the legislative website. There's a question of how do we save the transcript? I wish I knew the answer to that. Chances are that as the webinar admin, I will probably receive it in my email and I will do my best to remember to forward it along to you, sir. Okay, so a question about the most important factors to look at when comparing funding across district lines within the same state, and also a question about how to look at funding for school infrastructure. Okay, so I would say that when you look at actual spending data, so when you have information about actual funding or expenditure levels across district lines, that information, you might be looking at a federal data source, you might be looking at a state data source, but within the same state, and you'll see, generally speaking, just because this is the requirement, states have to report that split out by local and state sources. So you can see, is the big gap between two districts driven by a gap in local funding or in state funding or both? If it's driven by a big gap in state funding, then you might be looking at, okay, what are the student populations considered in the state's formula? Are there a lot of students with disabilities in one of these districts and not another? Is there a good reason that the state is sending a lot of money to this district and not that one? Is it Colorado and there's a lot of money allocated for small and rural districts? That's true in a number of states. And am I looking at a district that is small and rural versus an urban district? Those questions are really important if you're looking at gaps in state funding to look at the state formula calculation. However, if it looks like the disparity is in local dollars, then you want to be looking at the local share policy, and you want to be looking at the question of local floors and ceilings. So is there a funding floor or funding ceiling for local revenue? Are there minimums and maximums for what districts can raise? So the question about funding for school infrastructure, I wish I had a good answer to that. The problem is that school infrastructure policy and school infrastructure spending are actually quite non-transparent in a lot of places. It's not included in Fund Ed. It's an entirely separate area of policy. Sorry, I have a visitor. And so I'm sorry, but that is a little bit more challenging to determine, but that's something that we could certainly, discuss in an office hour session if that were helpful. Apologies, I'm looking to see if there are any other questions in the Q&A. I'm not seeing anything else come through. So I'll just wait one more moment to make sure that we don't have any more questions, but I just want to encourage everyone again, if they are interested in follow-up, to use that URL that I shared earlier. I will paste it one more time. So that is a tinyurl.com/talkfunding. And I hope that all of you found this to be useful. Please let me know if you'd like to discuss further. Thank you, everyone.